did not reply. That was the first thing I did when I read her email. Nothing. I set my phone face down on the kitchen counter, poured myself a second cup of coffee, and walked out to the back porch. It was a Tuesday morning in October, early enough that the neighbor's dog hadn't started barking yet, early enough that the street was still quiet. I stood there in my robe watching the light come through the oak trees, and I thought, so this is what it's come to. My daughter-in-law's name is Simone. She's 34 years old, works in marketing, and writes emails like a corporate memo. The subject line was, "Family boundaries going forward." I remember thinking, who writes a subject line like that to their husband's father? Who uses the word boundaries in a subject line? I read it twice, maybe 3 times. Then I put the phone down. My son's name is Owen. He's 39. I raised him in a 2-bedroom house in Dayton, Ohio, just the 2 of us after his mother passed, when he was 11 and I was 38, and I had absolutely no idea what I was doing. I was a structural engineer. I knew how to calculate load-bearing weights. I did not know how to braid a girl's hair or talk to a grieving child or make something other than scrambled eggs for dinner. Owen wasn't a girl, but the point stands. I learned as I went. We both did. He grew up fine. Better than fine, I thought. He went to Ohio State on a partial scholarship, graduated with a degree in finance, got a job in Columbus, met Simone at a work conference in Cincinnati, married her 4 years later. I flew in for the wedding. I danced badly at the reception. I cried in the parking lot afterward because his mother wasn't there to see it, and then I drove back to Dayton and told myself I'd done something right. That was 6 years ago. The email arrived on a Tuesday. It was 3 paragraphs long. The first paragraph said that Owen and Simone had been doing a lot of thinking about their family's needs. The second paragraph said they felt it was important for their household to have more predictability and structure, and that unannounced visits, even well-intentioned ones, disrupted their routines and created stress, particularly for their son Noah, who was 6 and apparently very sensitive to changes in schedule. The third paragraph said they hoped I would understand, and that they looked forward to scheduling visits in advance when the timing worked for everyone. There was no question mark anywhere in the email. It wasn't a conversation. It was a policy memo. I thought about Noah. He's my grandson. He has his father's ears and his grandmother's eyes, and I have never once shown up at that house without a reason he was happy to see me. Last Christmas, I drove 2 hours in a snowstorm with a box of Lego sets in the back seat because Owen mentioned offhand that Noah was into space stuff. The kid ran to the door in his pajamas. He didn't look disrupted. He looked like a 6-year-old who was happy to see his grandfather. I stood on the porch until my coffee went cold. Then I went inside, sat down at the kitchen table, and thought about what I'd given them. Not to count it. I'm not that kind of man. Or at least I've tried not to be. But it's hard not to think about it when you're sitting alone in a house that's too quiet and someone has just sent you a subject line that says, "Family boundaries going forward." I'd co-signed their mortgage 3 years ago when Simone's credit history came back thin, and Owen's debt-to-income ratio was too high for the bank to approve them a loan. I didn't tell anyone. Owen asked me not to. I signed the papers, drove home, and never mentioned it again. I'd paid for the new HVAC system when the old one died in February. That was just under $9,000, a carrier unit, professional installation. I bought Noah's school supplies every August since he started kindergarten because I happened to be there the first time, and it felt like our thing. I'd lent Owen $8,000 2 years ago when he said they were short on cash flow and needed to bridge a gap. He paid back $3,000. We stopped talking about the rest. None of that was the point. I want to be clear about that. I didn't give those things so they would owe me. I gave them because Owen is my son and Noah is my grandson, and that's what fathers do when they're able. But when you're sitting alone at a kitchen table, reading an email with a subject line like that, it's difficult not to notice the shape of things. I didn't call Owen that day. I didn't call him the next day either. What I did was this. I drove to my bank on Thursday morning. I spoke with a woman named Patricia who had helped me refinance my house 12 years earlier and who always remembered my name. I told her I needed to make some changes to a few automatic transfers. She pulled up my account. I walked her through it. The $800 a month that had been going into Owen and Simone's joint checking account. The amount I'd started sending 2 years ago, quietly, when Owen mentioned they were stretched thin. I moved to a separate savings account in my own name. I didn't cancel it. I just redirected it. That distinction mattered to me at the time, though I'm not sure why. Then I called the insurance company. My name was still on Owen's homeowner's policy as a secondary contact because of the cosign. I didn't remove myself. I couldn't legally without refinancing, but I made a note to call a real estate attorney the following week about my options there. I drove home. I made lunch. I sat in the backyard and watched a pair of cardinals in the oak tree for longer than I probably needed to. I want to tell you what those weeks were like, because I think people assume that when you stop giving, it feels like power. Like you've taken something back. That's not how it felt. It felt like a held breath, like waiting for something you can't name. I'm 67 years old. I've buried a wife. I've sat in hospital waiting rooms at 2 in the morning with no one next to me. I know what loss feels like, and I know what silence feels like, and this was a particular kind of silence that I hadn't experienced before. Not grief exactly, something more like clarity, the kind you get when something you've been pretending not to see finally comes into focus. I thought about Owen a lot during those weeks, not the 39-year-old man who had married someone who wrote emails with subject lines. The 11-year-old who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms and pretend he wasn't scared. The 14-year-old who tried to make me breakfast on Father's Day and burned the toast so badly I had to open all the windows. The 22-year-old who called me from Columbus the first night in his first apartment and didn't really have anything to say but stayed on the phone for 40 minutes anyway. I thought about where that kid went. I don't think he went anywhere, honestly. I think he's still in there. I think sometimes people just need to be reminded of what matters. And sometimes the only way that can happen is for the people who love them to stop making it easy to forget. That's what I told myself anyway. 6 weeks passed. The first call came on a Wednesday afternoon. Owen's name on my screen. I let it ring through to voicemail. He didn't leave one. The second call came the next morning. Same thing. This time he left a message. His voice was controlled, but I could hear the thing underneath it. Dad, call me when you get a chance. Something came up with the mortgage. I sat with that for a day. When I called him back, he picked up on the first ring. He said the bank had sent a notice. The cosign mortgage had flagged something. I won't go into the specifics because they're not mine to share. But the short version is that when I'd spoken to the attorney and begun the process of formally separating my name from the liability, it triggered a review, and the review surfaced some things about their payment history that the bank wanted to discuss. Owen hadn't told me they'd been late. 3 times in the past year, he said. Just a few days each time, but still. He said all of this very quickly. The way he used to talk when he was a teenager trying to explain something before I could react. I let him finish. Then I said, Owen, when did you last talk to me? Not about money, just talk to me. He didn't answer right away. I said, your wife sent me an email 6 weeks ago. Subject line was family boundaries going forward. You knew about that? A long pause. She mentioned she was going to reach out. She mentioned. Dad. I'm not angry, I said. And I meant it. I was past angry by then. Angry is a hot feeling. What I had was something cooler and quieter. I just want to understand when I became someone whose visits need to be scheduled 6 weeks in advance like a dentist appointment. He started to say something about Simone's anxiety, about Noah's routine, about how things had been stressful at work. I've heard those words before. They're not wrong words. Life is stressful. Routines matter. I'm not unreasonable. But there's a difference between adjusting to someone's needs and being handed a policy memo. I said, I love you. I love Simone. I love that little boy more than I can tell you. And I have been here for all of you in every way I knew how to be. You know that. He said yes. Quietly. So I need you to help me understand something, I said, because I'm trying to figure out whether I was your father or whether I was your contingency plan. The line went silent for long enough that I checked to make sure the call hadn't dropped. Then he said, "That's not fair." "Maybe not," I said, "but I'm 67 years old and I drove 2 hours in a snowstorm to bring your son a box of Legos because I love him and I missed him, and your wife sent me an email about disrupting routines. So fair is a complicated word right now." Another silence. I told him I wasn't going anywhere. I told him I wasn't cutting him off. I wasn't punishing him. I wasn't going to disappear. But I told him that some things were going to change. The automatic transfer was already changed. The attorney situation he would need to speak to the bank about directly. They could refinance if they wanted to remove me from the cosign, and I would cooperate fully with that process. The HVAC, the school supplies, the other things. I would need some time to think about what made sense going forward. He asked me what that meant. I said it meant he had a job and a house and a wife and a son, and it was time to live like a man who understood what that costs. I heard him exhale. We talked for another 20 minutes about things that had nothing to do with money. About Noah's soccer season. About a book Owen had been reading. About the oak tree in my backyard that the city was threatening to take down because the roots were getting into the sidewalk. Normal things, father and son things. When we hung up, I sat in the kitchen for a while. I thought about my father who died when I was 52 and who I still miss in the specific way you miss someone whose approval you never quite felt certain of. I thought about what it means to raise a child versus what it means to keep one comfortable. I thought about the difference between love as a feeling and love as a practice. Because those two things are not always the same, and I think for a long time I'd convinced myself they were. I wasn't a perfect father. I want to say that clearly. I worked too much when Owen was in high school. I was not good at saying the things out loud that I felt on the inside, which is a common failure among men of my generation, and a real one. There were times he needed me emotionally, and I handed him something practical instead. Because practical was the language I spoke. I'm aware of that. You carry those things. But I showed up. Every time I was asked, and a lot of times I wasn't asked, I showed up. And for a while I think I let showing up become a substitute for being present, and I let giving things become a substitute for saying things. And somewhere in that exchange, Owen learned that Dad would always be there to catch whatever fell, and maybe that's on me too. Not entirely, but some of it. The second call came 3 weeks later. This one was from Simone. I'll admit I was surprised. I let it ring once, then picked up. She said she wanted to apologize for the email, not the content, she said. She still believed in what she'd written, the thing about structure and predictability, but she could see how it had landed, and she was sorry for that. She said she and Owen had been talking a lot. She said she had not understood, until recently, what my presence in their lives actually meant versus what she'd let herself assume about it. I thought about the email with its subject line. I said, "Simone, I don't need an apology. What I need is to know that my son knows I'm his father and not his safety net." She said, "I think he's starting to understand that." I said, "Good, because I'm not going anywhere. But I'm also not going to keep showing up at the back door. Families walk in the front." She laughed a little, surprised, I think. I told her Noah was welcome at my house any weekend she wanted to make it happen. That offer wasn't going anywhere. She said she knew. She said he'd been asking about me. We hung up. I sat on the porch again. The oak tree was holding its leaves later than usual this year, something about the dry summer I'd read. The cardinals were back. I had my coffee. I'm not going to tell you everything is resolved, because it isn't. There are things between Owen and me that we haven't talked about yet. Things that go deeper than an email or an automatic transfer or a co-signed mortgage. That's work for another day, and probably more than one day. Families don't fix themselves in a single phone call. But 2 weekends ago, Owen drove Noah up to Dayton on a Saturday morning. No advanced scheduling. He just called me Friday night and said they were thinking of coming up if I was around. I said I was around. Noah ran up the porch steps and threw himself at me the way 6-year-olds do, like they've forgotten what gravity is. Owen stood at the bottom of the steps with his hands in his pockets, looking like an 11-year-old in a 39-year-old's body. And I looked at him, and he looked at me, and I said, "You want coffee?" He said, "Yeah." We spent the afternoon raking leaves, and I let Noah jump in the pile and destroy everything we'd done, over and over, the way kids do, and it didn't matter even a little bit. On the way out, Owen stopped at the door. Noah was already at the car, negotiating with Simone about something. Owen looked at me and said, "I know I haven't always." And then he stopped and started again. "I want to do better." I said, "I know you do." I said, "That's enough for now." And it was. It really was. I've been a father for 39 years. I've learned that the job doesn't end when they stop needing you to cut their food or check under the bed. It just changes shape. Sometimes the job is driving 2 hours in a snowstorm. Sometimes the job is stopping the automatic transfer and sitting with the silence until something real can grow back. I don't regret any of it. The signing, the payments, the HVAC, the Legos in the snow. I'd do it all again, but I'd do one thing differently. I'd have made sure he knew the difference between what I gave because I wanted to and what I gave because he asked. Because that distinction matters. It's the difference between a father and a bank. And I am not a bank. I am his father. I was his father before he had a mortgage, and I'll be his father when he doesn't. That's the part that doesn't get redirected. That part stays exactly where it's always been. The cardinals are still in the oak tree, by the way. The city decided not to cut it down after all. Turns out the roots were strong enough to hold without causing any real damage. Someone just had to look a little closer before they made any decisions. I thought that was worth mentioning. I've thought a lot about what actually happened here. Not the email, not the bank, not the phone calls. Those are just the events. I mean, what was underneath all of it? What caused what? I was a structural engineer for 31 years. My whole career was about understanding how weight gets distributed. Put too much load in one place for too long, and something gives. Not always where you expect, not always loudly, but it gives. I understood that about buildings for decades before I understood it about my own family. I made it easy for Owen. I made it easy from the beginning, and I told myself that was love, and it was, but it was also something else. It was me trying to be useful in the way I knew how to be useful, which was to fix things and pay for things and show up with solutions. What I didn't understand for a long time was that every time I caught something before it fell, I was also preventing him from learning what falling felt like. And you cannot build real strength in a person without letting them carry real weight. That's not blame. I want to be clear about that. Owen is a good man. He got lost for a while. Comfortable, I think, in a way that made him smaller than he actually is. But he's a good man. And Simone isn't a villain either. She's a woman who married into a dynamic she didn't fully see and responded to it in the only way she knew how. That email was tone-deaf and it landed hard, but I understand now that it came from a real place. They needed room to figure out who they were without me filling in the gaps. What I had to learn, and this is the part I'll carry with me, is that love without limits isn't actually love. It's a loan that never gets called in, and loans like that create a particular kind of debt that doesn't show up on any bank statement. It shows up in the way someone looks at you, in the subject line of an email. When I stopped the transfers and sat with the silence, I wasn't punishing Owen. I was finally telling the truth. I was saying, I believe you can handle this. I believe you are capable of more than you're doing. I believe you are a man, not a dependent. And sometimes the most honest thing a father can do is refuse to pretend otherwise. The hard part is that it required me to sit with the uncertainty of not knowing how he'd respond. I'm 67. I've made peace with a lot of things. But that particular silence, waiting to see if your kid rises to meet the moment or breaks under it, that doesn't get easier with age. It just gets quieter. He rose. Not perfectly, not all at once, not without a phone call that was half excuse and half plea. But he rose. In the afternoon, he drove Noah up to Dayton and stood at the bottom of my porch steps with his hands in his pockets, looking like himself again. The self he'd been before, comfort made him careless. That was worth every week of held breath. Integrity isn't something you can give a person. You can model it. You can create the conditions where it has room to grow. But ultimately, every person has to choose it for themselves. Usually in the moment when choosing, it costs something. Owen had to choose it when the easy option was gone. That's when character actually gets made. And Noah, that little boy jumping into the leaf pile, he's watching all of it. He doesn't know he's watching, but he is. Kids always are. That's the thing about the choices we make as parents. They don't just shape our children, they shape our grandchildren. They ripple outward in ways we'll never fully see. The best thing I can do for Noah isn't a Lego set or a tuition payment. It's showing him, through his father, what it looks like when a man stands up and carries his own weight. What it looks like when love is honest instead of convenient. I'm still working on some of that myself. Always will be.